Hey guys, I'm Caleb from ECS Tuning, and today I'm going to be showing you how to properly install brake pads and rotors on my MK6 GLI. For today's install, I chose Talon rotors. They're a high carbon iron rotor that is cross-drilled and slotted and has an anti-corrosion coating. I also chose HPS 5.0 pads. They feature a ferrocarbon compound, which should give it a pretty strong initial bite while still being predictable and smooth. They're definitely going to be quieter than a ceramic pad, but they should still be relatively low dust. Also for this install, I have all replacement OEM hardware, as well as an OEM approved brake fluid. On the tool side of things, we have our Schwaben brake caliper piston toolkit, Schwaben pressure brake bleeder, 11mm bleeder wrench, and a brake fluid catch bottle. We also have a few torque wrenches, ratchets, and a 1/2-inch breaker bar in case things get a little tricky. On the socket side of things, we have a 21mm socket, 13mm socket, M14 triple square, T30 Torx, and 7mm hex. Anytime you're working with braking components, it's a good idea to have a pair of gloves, as well as some shop towels and brake clean in case things get a little messy. We're going to be working on our shop rack, but if you're doing this at home, you're going to want to safely lift and support your car before getting started. Now let's get to it. To start things off, once you've safely lifted and supported the car, we're going to remove all 4 wheels. You're going to have to pry free the anti-rattle spring in the front of the caliper. Flathead screwdriver makes this really easy. Just give it a little pry, comes free, you can wiggle it out. We're going to want to pop these plastic caps out of the bushings, one on the top and one on the bottom. Then we're going to loosen these 2 guide pins, top and bottom. They're going to be a 7mm hex or an Allen. They shouldn't be too tight, so they should come right out. And then we're going to repeat the same thing for the top. All right, now we're going to pry the caliper off of the carrier and off of the pads. Screwdriver helps get a little bit of leverage in there. It may take a little bit of persuading. Once the caliper is freed from the pads, front one should come right off. And the inside one, you got to pop free from the caliper piston. Then you're going to want to hang your caliper somewhere where it's not going to put stress on those brake lines. Next, we have to remove the 2 carrier bolts. Preemptively, I have a 1/2-inch breaker bar and a 21mm socket just in case things get a little tricky. Okay. Now that both those bolts are broken free, come behind that with a ratchet, loosen them the rest of the way. Now we'll do the same thing to remove the top. You want to support the carrier with your other hand to prevent it from falling when you take this last bolt out. Now we're going to take out our rotor set screw right here. On this car, it's a T30 Torx. These things tend to be a little tight sometimes, so if you get a 3/8, give it a smack, it should come loose. Or not. It's super common for these set screws to be super galled up in there. You can try getting it out by hand, or you can use an impact screwdriver. Sometimes it'll pop it loose. In our case, broke the screw head right off. So we're just going to pull our rotor off and we'll drill and retap. Once you drill an appropriate size hole, you can select the right size tap. Go ahead and tap that hole. This one we already pre-tapped. And then once you're done, go ahead and pull that out. And you'll have bright, shiny new threads. Now that you got your old rotor off, you're going to want to clean up your hub, get rid of any corrosion that might be on there. Wire brush works great for this, but I replaced this hub this fall, so should be good to go with just a little bit of brake clean. Wipe it down with a rag. Before installing your rotors, you're going to want to take them out of the box and out of their bag. And most rotors come with an oil coating that prevents any corrosion during shipping or anything. You're going to want to remove that with some brake clean and a lint-free rag. However, Talon rotors feature a corrosion-resistant coating that doesn't need brake clean. Now we're going to put our rotor on. Because these are drilled and slotted, these are side-specific. I'm going to install the rotor up here, grab a wheel bolt, loosely thread that in, And that'll make sure that rotor doesn't go anywhere while we're getting our set screw. So, gonna make sure everything's lined up properly. Install that set screw into those new threads. Make sure everything's fully seated. Once that's snugged up, we're gonna grab our torque wrench. We're gonna torque this to 5 Newton meters. That's it. Take out that wheel bolt. Before installing your caliper carrier, it's always a good idea to hit with a little bit of brake clean. And give it a good cleaning with a wire brush, especially any spots that touch the brake pads. Now you're going to reinstall your caliper carrier. Install the bolts through the spindle. Find those threads. Start threading them in by hand. Now we're going to hit that with our torque wrench. We're going to torque these bolts to 200 Newton meters. We're going to do the same thing to the bottom, torquing that bolt to 200 Newton meters. Next, we're going to pry out these bushings here. You don't have to replace these, but it's always a good idea. You can try pulling them, you can try ripping them, whatever you got to do to get the old ones out. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to be using an angled pick here. Kind of push them out like that. You can see all that rust and corrosion that built up on there. We're going to do the same thing to remove this top one. And we're going to discard both these and replace them with the new ones. Before you install the new bushings, it's a good idea to hit these, a little bit of brake clean. Clean those up a little bit before we put the new bushings in. You can use a toothbrush, wire brush, whatever you can get in there to get those cleaned up. Next, we're going to slide our new bushings in. I usually start on the softer side, the longer side. Push it through the inside of the caliper. And wiggle it. It's going to take a pretty good bit of force. But we're going to push it all the way until this is here. Sometimes these are a little tricky to get in there. It helps to maybe put a little bit of grease on the outside and get them started from the inside, push them out. Once you can get to it, you can grab it gently with a pair of needle nose. You can twist and pull until they're fully seated. You can tell they're fully seated because the lip here and here is seated against the caliper, and you can see this ridge here is passed on both sides. Before we install the new caliper guide pins and the brake pads, we're going to want to clean up this caliper a little bit with some more brake clean and wipe it down with a rag. Use a wire brush here as well if you want to get a little bit extra clean. Next, we're going to compress our piston using our Schwab tool. Slides right into the caliper. As you thread this in, the cup will sit inside the caliper piston, and they'll brace against here where the brake pad usually sits. Rotate, and the piston will be compressed. You're going to grease your caliper slide pins. Take a little bit of brake lubricant, massage it onto the brake pin, the guide pin here. And then, on the back of the caliper, take a little bit extra of that brake lubricant, put it in the new bushings. Then whenever you're done, repeat the same process for the bottom. These Hawk brake pads include a brake pad wear sensor. If your car doesn't have a wear sensor, you can tie this out of the way, or I just find it easier to snip it off. Hawk includes brake part lubricant that you can apply to the back of the brake pads. Be sure not to get any on the friction surface itself. You're going to flip it over, and you can put a small amount on the back. Benefit of putting this grease is it makes sure that everything stays sliding freely. Things don't fuse up when things get spicy in there. Put a little bit around here, anywhere that the brake pad touches the caliper, and a thin layer on the back. Again, be sure not to get any on the friction surface itself. First, you're going to take your inside pad as the spring clip. You're going to slide it inside of the caliper piston. Sometimes it can take a little bit of force, so. There you go. The outside pad slides directly into the carrier. Now we're going to take our caliper, carefully slide it over so that both pads are against the rotor. You're going to slide your caliper guide pins into place, thread them in. As soon as I make contact, stop. We'll go to the other one. Again, these are 7mm hex Allen. There's contact right there, so we'll stop. All right, we're gonna go ahead and torque both of these to 30 Newton meters. There's one. And there's two. Now we're gonna go ahead and pop the new caps on. Finally, we're gonna install our anti-rattle spring. I usually start by sliding the top in place, then rotating the bottom, getting it lined up with the hole like that, making sure everything's fully seated. Looks good. Moving on to the rear, you're gonna need to loosen up these two bolts here to take the caliper off the carrier. You're gonna start by taking a 13mm wrench, breaking this free until you see this spinning. Oof. Until you see this spinning. Then, I'm gonna come behind that with a pair of needle nose vice grips to counter hold it. And you should be able to loosen this up. Now, we're just going to repeat the process to loosen the top bolt. The parking brake cable prevents the caliper from hanging too low and damaging the brake lines, so it can chill as is. We're just going to go ahead and pull both the old brake pads out. Next, we're going to have to remove the two 14mm triple square bolts that secure the carrier to the back of the spindle. I'm using a 1/2-inch breaker bar to break it loose. Now that it's broken loose, I'm going to come behind that with a ratchet and back this bolt out. These bolts are pretty long, so you might be here for a minute. Take your time. When you get to the last bolt, don't forget to support the carrier so it doesn't fall. Pull the rest out by hand. Go ahead and slide that bolt out. Now we're just going to repeat the process. Loosen the top bolt. So essentially there's a gear inside here, and as you hit it, forces it to rotate. It transmits the force of you and this into a rotational force. So we're gonna do that. There it went, did you see it? That's what's supposed to happen. And then, so a good trick when working on these, a lot of times these rear rotors get fused on. Install one of your wheel bolts. I was lucky enough that my rotor came free, no problem. But if yours doesn't, you can give it a couple taps here, rotate 180 degrees, give it a few taps, do that back and forth. Then if that still doesn't pop free, you can hit on the outside, get a little bit of leverage, flip it, another hit, and eventually it'll pop free and the wheel bolt will catch it. Then, remove the wheel bolt, remove the rotor. Before we install the new rotor, we're gonna want to clean up this hub here. Hit it with a little bit of brake clean. Use a cloth. These rears are a little dirty, so I'm gonna hit with a wire brush. Now that we're done cleaning up with a wire brush, hit it with a little bit more brake clean. Wipe away any metal or rust shavings. All right, ready for our new rotors. Same as the front. Gonna lift our rotor into place. Install a wheel bolt just for safety. Now we'll go ahead and install our rotor set screw. Then you can remove your wheel bolt and torque this to 5 Newton meters. Right there. Before we install the rear caliper carrier, we're going to want to clean this up. Show special attention anywhere where the brake pad contacts the carrier. We go ahead and hit this with a little bit of brake clean. Clean it up a little bit with a wire brush. Then hit with a little bit of brake clean again. Get that corrosion off. One important step before installing the rear carrier is to grease these slide pins. A lot of people don't pull these. All you have to do is pull this, like so. The pin comes out. You're gonna wanna go ahead, clean any of that old grease off. You can see how gritty and dirty that grease is. And we're also going to want to clean around and any grease that you can see here that you can get to with a cloth. Make sure you use a lint-free cloth. Clean away any of that excess. We're going to take a little bit of grease, put it right at the entrance, like so. Also take the pin inside the bushing. Put a little bit of grease in there as well. Then reinstall the pin. Ensure to rotate it to make sure it gets good coverage. Push it down. And that bushing should seat, like so. We're going to use the brake part lubricant that Hawk included with their pads. We're going to go ahead and apply a small amount to the backs, both these rear pads. Spread it around, being extra careful not to get this on any friction surfaces. Put a little bit on these springs up top. Once you're done, you're ready to reinstall your pads. So for the rear calipers, to compress this piston, you can't push it straight inward. You have to actually rotate it clockwise. You can see there's these 2 little notches cut out in the head of the piston. Those correspond with these 2 notches on our caliper compressor tool. So this will slide into those 2 notches and we'll rotate inward with our tool. I'll show you that now. Slide our tool to the caliper. We'll find those 2 notches. We're going to turn clockwise. And it'll slowly compress that piston. Now we're going to reinstall caliper carrier with our new hardware. And here's the top one. And we're going to go ahead, torque these bolts to 90 Newton meters. There's 1. 2. We're gonna go ahead and torque these an extra 90 degrees, since these are torque to yield. Anytime you see a torque spec that's plus 90 degrees, it's an angle of rotation. What that essentially is doing is it's hit its yielding point where it's torqued. The extra 90 degrees is actually physically stretching the bolt to make it longer, which locks the threads in. We'll do the same thing for the top one, and that's it for the carrier. Now we're just gonna take the caliper, carefully slide it over the pads. Like so. We're gonna go ahead and install these replacement caliper bolts. They have blue thread locker already applied. So we're gonna go ahead, line up the threads, slide it through. Install it by hand. Then we'll do the same thing for the top. Now we got both those bolts started, we'll come back in here with these vice grips with our wrench. We'll tighten that down the rest of the way until it's snug. Snug right there. We'll go ahead and do the same thing for the top. The torque spec for these is 35 Newton meters, which isn't a whole lot, and it's pretty tricky to get a torque wrench in here. So if you can't get it, no big deal. Make sure that you get it about as close as possible. I'm gonna try and get it with this universal. Now that we're done on the driver's side, I'm gonna go over and do the passenger side. To finish up installation, we're going to be reinstalling our brake fluid reservoir cap and pumping the brakes inside the cabin. My brake fluid has been flushed recently, and I'm actually going to be replacing it with the same type of fluid that's already in there. However, if your fluid is old or you're switching from one type to another type of brake fluid, you're going to want to extract any extra fluid that's in your brake fluid reservoir. Before we start bleeding, I'm going to fill our Schwaben pressure brake bleeder with some new brake fluid. So I'm going to go ahead and pump the brake pedal until it feels fully firm. That feels good right there. With our Schwaben pressure brake bleeder attached to our brake fluid reservoir, now we can pump up the pressure bleeder and make sure that everything holds pressure. Per VW, the brake should be bled at approximately 2 bar or 30 PSI. So we're going to pump it up there now. When you're bleeding your brakes, the general rule of thumb is you want to start at the brake located farthest from the master cylinder. However, for Volkswagen, on this car, I recommend starting at the brake caliper closest to the brake fluid reservoir and working outward. We're going to start by removing the protective rubber cap from the brake bleeder. Next, we're going to take our Schwaben bleeder catch bottle, hang it somewhere. We're going to take our 11mm bleeder wrench, install it onto the bleeder screw, then take the other end of the brake fluid catch bottle, pop it onto the end. With the bleeder wrench attached, I'm going to break the bleeder screw free, and the old fluid will be forced through the lines and into the brake fluid catch bottle. You're going to let this run for a few seconds until the brake fluid runs clean with no bubbles. I usually let it go for about 5 to 10 seconds or so. Then once you're satisfied that the fresh brake fluid has been flushed through the lines, go ahead, snug up the bleeder screw. Once you're done, pop the protective rubber cap back onto the bleeder screw. So we're going to repeat the same process, working away from the master cylinder until we've hit all 4 wheels. Now that we're done bleeding the brake system, we're going to remove our pressure bleeder from the brake fluid reservoir. Just check and set your fluid level and reinstall the cap. Last, but certainly not least, reinstall the wheels, install the wheel bolts, and torque them to spec. Once our wheels are fully installed, the final step is to properly bed in our brakes. Before using your fresh new pads and rotors, it's important to bed them in properly. Hawk recommends doing 10 stops from approximately 35 miles an hour down to about 5 miles an hour, and then 3 pretty aggressive stops from about 45 down to 5. After you hit those stops, things are going to be pretty spicy in the brake area, so you're going to want to take your foot off the brake, be careful not to drag the brake pedal, and coast for a little while to let things cool down. Once things have gotten cooled down, find somewhere you can stop and park, and be sure you don't touch the parking brake. Alright, I'm going to go bed in our brakes now. One thing that's important to note is you're going to be doing a lot of stopping and going in a quick succession, and you want to do these stops as close together as possible. So make sure you find a nice straightaway where there's not going to be any people around and you're not going to be freaking anybody out. I think I found a pretty good back road over here. We'll use that. Alright, so I'm going to bring the car up to 35 miles an hour, then hit the brakes, and slow down to 5. Speed back up to 35 miles an hour, and slow down to 5. That's 3, so I'm going to do 7 more of those, and then we're going to move on to the aggressive stops. Alright, now that we've done our moderate stops, I'm here cruising about 45 miles an hour, and I'm going to slam on the brakes fairly hard and not come to a complete stop, maybe about 5 miles an hour. Do that 2 more times. So here we go, hold on. Do that 2 more times. That's it. Now that my brakes are bed in, I'm going to cruise pretty slowly here. I'm going to try my best to keep my foot off that brake pedal. You don't want to drag that brake pedal because those brake pads are real hot right now, and letting those sit can deposit brake material onto those rotors and cause what's called rotor warp. We want things to be nice and even. Try and stay off the brake pedal here. Just coast slowly, make this turn, and we'll let things cool down. Once you've driven on the brakes for a while and gave them a chance to cool, kept your foot off that brake pedal, slowly come to a stop, put your car in park, and let them rest for a couple of minutes. We want those brake rotors to become completely cool to the touch, but I wouldn't recommend touching them to find out. Alright, I've given my rotors about 15 minutes to cool. I think we're good to go. Well, that wraps up the brake pad and rotor DIY on my MK6 GLI. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our customer service team. Remember, all the links to the parts and tools that I use will be in the description below. Make sure you throw a like on the video and subscribe for future Enthusiast content.